The adaptations they're going to get are going to be different based on their demands, but really where the specificity might come in is the energy system work that you're doing. So the 50-meter sprinter who's doing 20-second efforts, they're going to be doing a lot of like high intensity interval training. They're going to be doing a lot of like ATP work from an energy system standpoint. High intensity, high velocity, high tempo, and lots of rest. And they're going to be doing a lot of strength and power training. They're going to look big and muscular. In a lot of cases, the 50-meter sprinters look like bodybuilders. Blunted to an extent because they're still also doing aerobic work, and they're not working on mass for the sake of mass. It's functional mass. Their physiques are going to look different, but I think the strength training is very similar. I want to see even the milers work on strength training, work on power. They're focused more on like sub-maximal sustained power for their energy system work and translating that strength to sub-maximal power in the water. But the strength training in my mind is very similar. Like I'm not doing endurance training with the milers because they're like more endurance athletes, but they're certainly swimming longer intervals in the pool.
Hello friends, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Mayn Idea Podcast, where today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Daly. A quick reminder for those of you that enjoy this podcast, please take 30 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and subscribe to the YouTube channel. This helps the show get discovered organically and helps me continually bring on amazing guests. Also, there are now timestamps in the show notes, so feel free to jump around, although I recommend listening to the episode in its entirety. Daly is a competitive open water swimmer, internationally recognized swim coach, Division II All-American, national finalist, and co-creator of the most successful swim offering from Equinox, EQX H2O. During his time with Equinox, he was recognized as a 2-time Educator of the Year and 3-time Personal Trainer of the Year, and has been featured in every major fitness publication. His ability to utilize strength training knowledge and swim expertise make him a unique force in the coaching space. Combine that with a knack for the creative, and you have a coach whose philosophy is spreading like wildfire in the swimming community. I hope that you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Without further ado, Daly. The top. So thank you for taking the time to be here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I love what you're doing, and it's great to chat. So it's cool to connect this way.
It actually has been, for those listening, Dan and I have similar backgrounds in that we were both trainers at Equinox for a long time, but it has been very nice to have a few people like yourself in the quick reach book where I can kind of branch out and say, hey, like, how are you doing with this? Or what kind of things are you working through on the content creation side and really like getting something going for yourself? So I definitely appreciate the willingness and the open door there on the communication.
Yeah, I mean, you're welcome. Social media is kind of the new like work network. So I interact with a ton of people and primarily that way, and it's been great. So I'm happy to help when I can and, be a resource for people.
So I figured that a little bit of this is selfish because I've just been curious, but it is a rare opportunity to kind of Equinox hats off and talk about this. But what led you to leave Equinox One? Because you and I in different ways have been on somewhat similar tracks in that we had this extensive training background in somewhat of a big box setting with a lot of support, and going into something that's much more entrepreneurial that has, trade-offs, right? I mean, there's a lot of freedom there, but there's also a lot of uncertainty. And I've kind of watched as you've gone and really created something spectacular with what you're doing through swim coaching. So what was it that made you comfortable leaving or uncomfortable leaving? And was that initial genesis to like get out the door and actually go do something on your own?
It sounds like a huge question, but, I was there for like a decade and wearing a lot of hats like you were and just doing a lot of different things and, getting great skills, meeting great people, and just experimenting with things. And I just began realizing my niche was really in swimming, and I was doing some swim stuff there and it was going well. But, there's opportunities there and there were other things that weren't there. And I was just getting to a point where I sensed that what I was doing well, I could do on my own. And the pandemic, some of these things were in play before the pandemic, but the pandemic really accelerated those things. And there was also this period of like great uncertainty of whether or not, what I was doing is going to continue in that same way. And it was just a good time to move on and transition. And what I was most scared about was like having leads and being able to build a business and have a following and some of the support and the infrastructure and the systems that a corporate environment provides for you. But what I've realized in hindsight was I was doing a lot of those things so well that it's actually been really easy. And actually the growth has been greater by just focusing on my own brand, my own marketing, my own systems. It's really, I love working for myself. It's great. More freedom of time. There's stress and things to worry about, but for the most part, I find that it's easier and more fun, and I can pick and choose when I want to do, and I just have control over those choices and my time, which is huge.
Were you someone, when you were training at Equinox, were you someone that was very active in the social space on your own?
I wasn't so much. I had a presence, and I think I also had a reputation from, teaching other instructors and getting in front of a lot of people every week. But I didn't have a huge social media presence, but I started to lean into that more in, 2017, 2018. And I really went all in during the pandemic. I had this glut of time suddenly, and I'm like, I really need to market myself. I need business. There's this huge loss of business. And I was able to spend time on it and video content, create content, figure out what works, figure out who my audience is, who I want to market to, what that message is. And I've leaned into it in a big way since 2020, and now it's a huge part of my business.
Yeah, growing your account to over 100,000, not just growing your account over 100,000 people, right? That's one thing. But to have of that 100,000 people, a strong group of people that are engaged with what you're making is a very different thing. And I feel like in the past, people have been very interested in the number of getting to a certain amount of people, but we all know that that amount of people really doesn't mean anything for a business unless they are engaging and consuming the content that you're making. And that means that what you're producing has to be quality and have substance and value. And it seems like what you do make, whether it's a 5-second video or a longer video, you're always giving a piece of value to the person that's consuming it. So you're giving a piece of information that they probably didn't have before they came across that. When in that journey of okay, I'm going to actually go into this, I'm really going to put my heart and soul into this, and I recognize the social space as something that's going to be powerful for me. What were the speed bumps along that way in the beginning as you get to this place where now it's very streamlined? You have a specific structure that you're using and probably tweaking here or there. But what were those initial steps like?
Well, at first, you're just maybe you think you just need followers. And to your point, you don't need 100,000 followers. You need 100 really engaged followers that want your business or whatever you're trying to engage with or, exchange value for. But at first, it was maybe trying to gain attention and following, and it was posting stuff that was kind of more entertaining and esoteric. And if you can scroll back and look at some of the early stuff, and I think some of it is relevant. I was never doing backflips with my shirt off. There's probably value there, but that wasn't my style. But I would post some things that maybe were more engaging because you have a few seconds to grab your audience's attention, and then you can rope them in a little bit more. But at first, maybe it was some more esoteric and interesting things of oh, I haven't seen that before. And it's yeah, this is cool, but it's not what I do all the time. And now that I have more of a captive audience, I can really craft and curate my message, and I can be more specific. And I really like to teach. So there's an element of that, but social media is an element of entertainment. It's an element of education. It's, there's all these different things that you want to take into consideration to have kind of a perfect storm or just a really powerful post or growing account. But at first, maybe it was a little more superficial and trivial, and you kind of start to see what works, what people are resonating with, and then you can start to dial it in more specifically over time.
Yeah, the structure of it, I've always found this interesting, and it's maybe more specific to coaches like yourself who you have a wealth of knowledge pre-existing where your business is at right now. Like you said, you're already in a highly effective training role for over a decade, which was chock full of continuing education and certification, not just for certification's sake, but to better your knowledge so that you could then help your clients, right? So it's not just putting another thing on your resume, but actually taking that information, utilizing it, applying it, developing programs like what you did for Equinox. And with that, at least I can speak for myself, comes this understanding that there's these principles of movement that are applicable to all sports. And I think this a lot about when I was a kid and I was skiing. There was so much of what we were doing in the training hall that just, I didn't know what it felt like then because I had nothing to compare it to. But as I got older and I became more versed in different training modalities and ways that you can train and periodization, I realized that, okay, if I'm running or I'm swimming or I'm skiing or I'm mountain biking, there's these principles that for the general person are like instrumental in your ability to do them. So different patterns that your body will go through to move an object, for example, proficiencies in balance and shifting your weight from side to side, whatever it is. And I see in your posts and stuff, you're taking concepts that people might find in like a gym setting and showing them, like actually splicing them side by side, saying like, look, this is the mechanic that you may have experienced while you were at the gym. You're interested in swimming. Here's how it actually plays out directly in the sport that you're interested in. And you're bridging these two worlds that take years of experience of understanding them in their own silos to like bring them together. When was it that you started to see that things like a deadlift or a kickstand deadlift or a kettlebell swing actually had a place in the pool?
Well, I started leaning more into swimming at my time at Equinox and started the EQX H2O program with another colleague. And I just saw the pool as this extension of the gym that people weren't fully utilizing. And like, you know, I was a little bit sick of like all the volume I did in college as a swimmer. And I was looking as how can I make swimming a part of my fitness routine that's fun and exciting, and also utilize this underutilized asset or space that we have in this facility, and kind of, you know, bring people off the gym floor into the pool space and show them how it can be a fit and fun way to get fit, to be strong, to develop your cardiovascular system. And I just started drawing those connections. I think to your point, there was so much education. We'd learned so much. Like there's some really amazing coaches who can coach like the whole person in a variety of ways, regardless of what their activity is. Being able to connect some of those dots, you don't see that in the sport world all the time. Like there might be some really great ski coaches or really great swim coaches who don't appreciate strength training or aren't able to connect those dots for their athletes that maybe we didn't see when we were growing up playing sports. And now I feel like I have a high level swim background with a high level, like decade plus, 15 plus year coaching background. Now I'm able to marry the two and really bring the best of both. And people are really resonating with that because they're just a lot with swimming, actually, because it's huge. It's people swim for fitness. People are former college swimmers. People want to be a swimmer and never were and get into it later in life, or they want to do triathlon or open water. And there's so many avenues even within that community that I'm actually still trying to craft kind of my niche and my message. But at the same time, I can kind of capture like a really big audience and bring the best of what we know from that strength and conditioning standpoint, a coaching standpoint, personal training, and really just help people, you know, use swimming as a means to like reach their goals, which, you know, a lot of times goals are deeper than just doing like your next triathlon. There's something like more intrinsic, and we can tap into that as good coaches.
I think that within that too, there's when you tie like an activity to the training, it levels up the training automatically. And then it has the potential to change the lifestyle habits around it. Because if you're just training to not live a sedentary lifestyle, which is a fantastic reason to go and start doing something like that, that's kind of one level. But when you then take the skills that you're learning and the proficiencies that you're developing and you put them into an athletic setting, be that recreational swimming, a triathlon, a run club, something like that, and then you get to experience the payoff of what you're doing, it's really impactful. And you can actually see that the two are helping each other out. And then it can drive that behavior further. Do you see that a lot with people that you take on, maybe more in like the one-on-one space or the group space?
I do, yeah. I mean, it's like beyond, it's just so powerful. There's so many like kind of routes here, but like I was never one to just train for fat loss or just train for aesthetics, or like I'm just gonna, like my clients just hire a trainer because they need a coach and they need accountability. I think everyone wants to be an athlete to some degree. They want to feel successful. They want to feel strong. They want to feel athletic. And if we can tap into that a little bit by drawing some connections with like things they already do well or things they're already doing and how that supports other things that they might want to do, or maybe they didn't, like I have clients who like take up swimming later in life. They didn't even know they wanted to be a swimmer, do a triathlon or do this swim event. And suddenly they're like really amazing swimmers, and that's really powerful. And it's a sport you can do your entire life. So even finding it later in life, your later decades, you know, there are just a couple of people who just turned 100 and were at the U.S. Masters and National Championships, like at 100 years old, breaking records and swimming their best. So I guess maybe finding everyone's inner athlete. And I've always found that the best coaches were the ones with an athletic background who could give their clients some type of performance goal that wasn't so superficial, for lack of another word, or extrinsic of like, all right, you're 10% body fat, now what? It's like, no, you're 10% body fat because you've been training like a professional, like a professional athlete. And now you're also accomplishing this this trip or this event, and you feel really good about both, and they really reinforce each other.
That's such a good point, because I feel like the aesthetic part of it, it's kind of like the door to get in for a lot of people. It's the most tangible thing you can think of is, I want to feel different in my body. I want this pair of jeans to fit. I want that shirt to fit by this day or that vacation or whatever it is. So there's that quick application or result for body fat goals or weight management goals. But once you get past that, if there's not a why underneath it that's meaningful, it's, I think, where a lot of people fall off of their routine, or they fall off out of their training, or a work trip completely disrupts what they're after. But the clients that you see begin to adopt different behaviors that are outside of the gym become like, not addicted. I don't want to use addicted because of the negative connotation, but it becomes part of their life so much more readily. And so even something small, like you said, a performance goal of improving some certain amount of time, let's say, if that happens, the aesthetic parts are going to happen as a byproduct of it, but you get more longevity down the road with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but if like you want to look like a certain athlete that you admire for whatever reason, maybe you need to train that way to some regard within your ability and your, you know, your skill set and the other demands you have in your life.
That episode at ESPN, The Body Issue, always trips me out so much, because you just get to see across, like, you know, they have like Rob Gronkowski in there, and then they'll have a professional swimmer, and then a sprinter, and then a linebacker and a volleyball player. And you just see like each of these sports really does change the body type so much for the performance of what's demanded in that setting. And I was actually listening to a podcast you did, and I thought that this was so interesting about fat content and buoyancy for open water swimmers. And I never thought about that before, because I think when you consider elite anything, you also conflate that with just optimal body type, like lean mass, no excess fat, and all for the reason of being like more athletic and driven. But then here's an instance where, or I guess there's an argument, or maybe like the school of thought is a little split on it, but that having this excess body fat on purpose can actually be a benefit to your ability to stay on track in open water, where current and waves and things have a tendency to push you around. I thought that was really fascinating.
Well, thanks for listening. I don't remember where I said that, but it's a common theme. In fact, I posted something on floating this week that's been getting kind of like some viral feedback on it, but just people engaging
on floating, like just static buoyancy,
just on being able to float. Yeah. And I'm arguing that everyone can float. Yes, body fat's going to affect that, bone density, lung volume, things like that, but everyone can float. You just need to work on it. And a lot of people are like, oh, I'm a sinker, or I'm all muscle mass, or I'm dense bone, and I'm going to sink. It's a skill, which maybe we could talk about, but yeah, sports are interesting. You know, open water swimming is a sport 100%, but the demands of it are very unique, because in some ways, maybe gaining some of the body fat that might keep you warm in the cold water could actually maybe make you not swim as fast. Statistically, I haven't looked at it, but I know, like, I've looked at some statistics on like body fat percentages on like the top 6 people, like on the podium, for example, and they fit into like a statistical standard or norm. So like if you want to be top 6, like cross country skier, those guys and gals are probably all single digit body fat.
Totally. Yeah.
Swimming is a little different. We see a lot of lean swimmers, but we also see swimmers who are very fit, but aren't necessarily like super striated and ripped, you know, so to speak. So it
Why
depends
is that?
on the,
do you think?
I think we all have different genetics and different nutritional strategies and some of the leanest swimmers that we see are actually leaning into strength training in a big way, which is like part of my niche and my agenda or my message. But I've been looking at it a lot and just looking at some really elite swimmers, and they're not all completely ripped the way we might think of it. They're lean and slim, maybe for a swimmer standards. You know, bulk is not necessarily beneficial for swimming, but a little bit of body fat might have an advantage. I don't know to what extent at the highest level. The conversation I kind of struck up this week on social media was I want to dig into this a little bit and see, can we quantify like body fat to buoyancy and how it might change, I don't know, propulsion and your ability to move through the water. I'm not quite sure.
So I don't know a ton about open water swimming other than I can imagine the gravity of the challenge of the situation and why you're supported when you do it and the ability to veer off track and all these kind of things. But if I'm thinking about it from like an energy standpoint, is there part of it that could be the fat metabolism? Like it's better to have fat stores on deck for, let's say it's a 100-kilometer swim is 62 miles or something like that. So that's a long, super long swim. And I don't know, maybe you can explain if that's broken up into stages or not. But if you're talking about that kind of endurance, you're not going to be anaerobic. Now we're getting like a little nerdy about it, but you're not going to be anaerobic that whole time because you couldn't be. So if you're more aerobic, then you're going to metabolize fat better. So if you have more fat in storage, do you think that there's like an energy trade-off thing going on there? And that's why you would see that body type in that sport?
I think even the leanest person has more than enough body fat stores calorically to sustain like a very long effort. One thing to point out, like, I think swimming 100 kilometers is like, I think only maybe 2 people have done that.
Nice. So, but not the best example.
Yeah, it's a handful. I mean, that would be tremendous. Other people have done like swims like that in stages, and it's more than 2 people. It's a handful of people. But you have enough body fat to sustain that effort. So, people are swimming for up to like 2 days, 40, 50 hours of swimming, much the way we're seeing like ultra marathon and other type of events, and you can sustain it. These athletes are also fueling throughout with carbohydrates because even though it is mostly an aerobic effort, there are elements, there's glycolytic efforts where you're burning carbohydrates as fuel. So they're fueling with carbohydrates. They're highly trained aerobic fat burning, athletes as well. But we all have enough body fat to sustain that type of effort. I don't know. I'd have to think really deeply about like the exact physiology of it and whether or not it's advantageous to have a little more body fat. In the open water, particularly with cold water, it's just sometimes advantageous to have what you refer to as like bioprene and having a little bit more insulation because open water swimming rules dictate that you have to do this in a regular suit with like a cap and goggles on. You're not allowed to wear anything else.
Oh, wow.
So there's people who will do swims like that with neoprene, which keeps you warmer with a wetsuit on. But it's in a different category. But I don't think having more body fat gives you more fat as fuel to do that activity because you're fueling in other ways anyway, and you probably have enough. Even the leanest person probably has enough to do these events if they didn't fuel.
I've always, I think in the back of my head, been trying to figure out this. I think certainly in elite sports, I've always felt and supported the idea that in elite sports, that is where you see the expression of genetics make a difference. Is not in your ability to change your body type on kind of the entry level, but if you're talking about the most elite athletes, a genetic difference from one to the other definitely will predispose one athlete to be a better performer than the other. And if you look at, I always think fight sports I'm a big fan of fight sports, but if you look at a lot of top level guys, sometimes they'll carry excess body fat into the ring and then they'll go 5-minute rounds of all out effort. And it blows my mind. You just kind of would think in your head that they would be these lean, shredded machines. And they are machines, but their body type seems counterintuitive to that. And it sounds like maybe somewhere in the swim world too, and in other sports, you get optimal performance with what would seem like suboptimal aesthetics.
Yeah. I don't know. There's probably a stereotype in all those sports. Like in fight sports, you have to make weight in some instances, and
Right.
if you're a heavyweight fighter, it might be more advantageous to be a little heavier. In swimming, the good news is weight doesn't matter as much. Statistically, people probably do follow into certain heights and weights, the most successful ones outside of exceptions and anomalies. And swimming's unique because there's so many different events that a 50-meter sprinter that takes 20 seconds is going to look a lot different than the person who swims a mile, and is going to look even more different than the person who swims 25 kilometers. So it depends on your event. And then certain strokes are more muscular than others. So the breaststrokers look different than the freestylers, than the backstrokers.
If we talk about those three distances, so I think you said 25-mile, a sprint, and what was the other one that you mentioned in there?
Well, going shortest to longest, it's the 50-meter sprint is the shortest event. Yep. And then you have, I don't know what I said in between, the mile maybe?
Yeah,
is
mile.
The longest pool event, actually. And then the longest professional event is 25 kilometers now, which is not that popular. The 10K is kind of the sweet spot, but it'll go up to 25 kilometers.
So from a coaching perspective, if you were to, maybe we can dive into a little bit on the strength training side here, but with these three differences or distances, there's varying difference in demand on what the body is doing while you're performing that length. How do you incorporate strength training into those different distances? Like, what are some things that maybe people should consider when they're adopting a new routine and it is specific to one of those?
That's a big can of worms. And what's interesting is I'm working with a lot of adult amateurs who want to do like anything from 800 meters in the open water to 100 kilometers. Actually, I've had people who go that far, and it's different. I think the strength training approach is actually very similar. With the adaptations they're going to get are going to be different based on their demands, but really where the specificity might come into more is the energy system work that you're doing. So the 50-meter sprinter who's doing 20-second efforts, they're going to be doing a lot of like high intensity interval training. They're going to be doing a lot of like ATP work from an energy system standpoint, high intensity, high velocity, high tempo, and lots of rest. And they're going to be doing a lot of strength and power training. They're going to look big and muscular. In a lot of cases, the 50-meter sprinters look like bodybuilders.
Wow.
Blunted to an extent because they're still also doing aerobic work, and they're not working on mass for the sake of mass. It's functional mass. These guys are muscular, and I would argue have envious physiques. I'm biased.
Are you going to change your event?
Am I going to change my event?
Yeah, to sprinting.
I was a 50-meter sprinter actually.
Oh, you were in college.
And did some middle distance like 100, 200. So I was more of a sprinter and had a literal and figurative strength for strength training, and always really embraced that and enjoyed that aspect of it. So I did a lot of that and was on the more muscular side. Maybe not as fit and muscular as I was back in college, but still, like, I'll show up for an open water event and people probably look and be like, I wonder how that guy's going to swim with that mass. But
right. Incredible.
Yeah. Amazing. Their physiques are going to look different, but I think the strength training is very similar. I want to see even the milers work on strength training, work on power. They're focused more on like sub-maximal sustained power for their energy system work and translating that strength to sub-maximal power in the water. But the strength training in my mind is very similar. Like, I'm not doing endurance training with the milers because they're like more endurance athletes.
Yeah.
But they're certainly swimming longer intervals in the pool.
So I was thinking about this specifically. So you have someone they're doing longer distances, let's say, or I don't know, let's just take, I guess, the average person who's like, I'm going to do my first triathlon, right? And they're not doing an Ironman, but they're not doing a sprint. So they're right in the middle. And their statement would be, I don't need a strength train because I'm already doing all this other stuff. I'm biking a couple times a week. That's really good for my legs. I'm running. That's really good for my legs. And I'm swimming. So I take care of my upper body, which is funny because it discredits the amount that your entire body is involved in swimming anyway. But how do you approach that conversation? Because I'm sure that, one, you're answering a question and an issue that exists in the world where people are not thinking about training and swimming. And now they are, and that's your presence is growing in this space because it's connecting with people that maybe weren't bringing those dots together. So I would imagine that this conversation exists quite a bit out there, or maybe in the past. How do you digest that question, and then what are kind of the intro points that you would begin to talk to someone about there? Why you really do need strength training, even for something like swimming?
I feel like I used to get that argument a lot more when I was working with general clients, and kind of like, we would just be handed leads, so to speak, of random clients with random goals, and which is probably also why we got good at working with a variety of people. So I can't tell you how many regular personal training clients that I've had who also run and be like, oh, we don't need to train lower body, I run all the time. Ultimately, like, we want what the client wants, and it's building rapport and kind of maybe winning them over with the best approach over time. So you can start to point things out as you see deficits in their function, deficit in their strength, or they have a specific goal, and you can start to be like, if we added squats, for example, to your plan, we might see these hip injuries less often in your running, or you might be able to hit your pace goal if you were stronger. So we can win them over time. So we kind of win them over time. Increasingly, I'm lucky that a lot of people are seeing kind of the message that I'm putting out there, and they're approaching me because they're like, hey, I've been swimming and doing triathlon for a while. I haven't been strength training. I have X, Y, and Z injury, or I'm not hitting like X, Y, and Z goals, and I feel like strength training is the missing piece. Could you help me? And that's an easier conversation. But they still come in with some myths and misconceptions, and you just have to earn their trust and kind of win them over time. By showing them results. So it's sometimes like, hey, trust me for a month and let's put this plan together. And I know you're going to decrease your stroke count, or you're going to have less shoulder discomfort when you get into like your, later in the week with your volume or whatever the case may be. Or ultimately, I know you're going to swim faster if you do this. So, there's a couple of angles there, and I don't know. Sometimes a little bit of what they want and a little bit of what they need, and just trying to find a balance, and kind of, it's a little bit of like a client relationship dance.
It's hard to manage that. I think it's one of the challenges of being a coach, right? Is, like you said, you have to give people what they want because they're coming to you for something that is important to them in here somewhere. But then you also know, especially as the former athlete, as the coach, like, how the body works, what really needs to happen. But there is this fine line between that where you get the trust and the rapport and the opportunity to then kind of later down the line teach them those other elements that are present in the beginning, but maybe they're not ready to receive that coaching criticism yet, or have something new brought into it. It seems like the results point of it is really valuable there. Showing them how something is impacting their, what you said, their stroke count, or showing them like a time or something like that. Is stroke count one of the most readily changeable and impactful things for someone who's swimming already but new to strength training?
Well, it depends on where they are in their competitive career, but yes, like, going faster, whether it's running, biking, or swimming, is a combination of your tempo and how much distance you're covering with each stroke. So particularly in swimming, because it's shorter, we want to be counting strokes per length and measuring that in a variety of ways. And one way that we know we're transferring strength and force or propulsion in the water from strength training is actually, are we covering more distance with each stroke? So there's ways to do that in the water. And just kind of going back to strength training, swimming is interesting because water is a resistance and it is full body, and we can load our hands with paddles and load our feet with fins and use parachutes and forms of resistance. So there's ways to strength train in the water, but there's also benefits of strength training on land. And when people are getting stronger, they're taking fewer strokes per length, or they're going faster at the same stroke rate, or they're able to take more strokes and go faster as well. So there's a couple of ways to look at that and a couple of ways to measure it. And that's a big thing, actually, when I talk strength training with swimmers, is we're going to reduce your stroke count to a degree. That's more like on the efficiency end of the spectrum. It's like, how low can we reduce your stroke count? How high can we get your stroke count with like power training, speed and turnover? And then we're going to find some type of sweet spot based on like your body type and also like what your event is.
So I'm trying to think in my head of these exercises that really transition to skiing or swimming. And to the point earlier where I was saying, you can start to see how certain movement patterns or mechanics transition well. Like if someone can't, proficiently hinge at their hips and you get them to, that's a proprioceptive benefit. They're better understanding where they are, but that's also a mechanical benefit that they can now perform a joint action that they weren't before. And so that's better body awareness. Then you take something like swimming that maybe from the outside seems simple, but actually does require a ton of body awareness to be able to stay in the right position in the water and move. So something like teaching someone a hip hinge with a dowel and then getting them to deadlift and then getting them to swing might not seem like a swimmer's exercise, but it could potentially be a huge difference maker for them. So when you're kind of building this library of exercises for people, visually there's things for me looking in from the outside that make tons of sense. Like when you're prone on the, it's like a ski erg basically, but you're prone on it and you can use your hands.
Swim erg.
Yeah, a swim erg. It looks exactly like skiing. Cardiovascularly, you're getting your heart rate up through motions with your arms. You have resistance because your body's moving. So I'm like, okay, that makes total sense. What are some of the exercises that you feel like might not be as easy to transfer to swimming visually, but are really big payoffs for people looking to get into strength training specific to benefiting their swimming?
Well, we're going to start with the basics, and you should be squatting and deadlifting, pushing and pulling. And it might be harder to sell squatting and deadlifting, to a swimmer, but like breaststroke and butterfly, it's a little different because it is, it's what we call short axis, and it's more of a hip generated lower body action. Yep. So we can draw some parallels there. And if we just talk to your point of like, first I want to establish function. So like we need to make sure like you can get your arm into full flexion overhead. You can get into a hip hinge because you're going to need all those joint actions are joint actions. The human body can only do so many things. We all have the same anatomy. So let's first establish that all those things work. Your hardware works the way it's supposed to. And then we want to make those patterns strong and powerful. And the best way to do that is just the basics, squatting and deadlifting, pushing and pulling. We can get into swim specificity, and the swimmer from Vasa is a terrific product and a very specific way to be able to load that posture and that pattern. But that's built on a foundation of like pull-ups and rows and planking and core positioning. And we're going to reinforce it with products like that where, I don't know, that's an interesting product because we can work on technique and reinforce technique positions. There's some potentiation things with being able to like really emphasize power on those devices. And then you can also use it for energy system work. So wow, that's a part of it, but it's also a lot of the basics of, just the 6 or 7 core movements that everybody should be doing, the big patterns and getting as strong and as powerful as possible. And then the specificity of swimming comes more in the water.
So do you think of a lot of this from like a functional movement screen view? Kind of like, let's get you to push, to pull, to hip hinge, to do knee dominant stuff, to flex and extend and like operate from that base and then build these other things? Absolutely.
And I kind of pull and draw from the best of a lot of those assessment thought processes or, those systems. But your hips, shoulders, and ankles should be mobile and they should be able to do a certain amount of things. And the truth is, regardless of like who you are, swimmer, triathlete, skier, wherever you're coming from, we see things, and particularly in the adult world where I'm working primarily, that those things don't work as well as they should. So there's best practices for making sure those things can move better. And then we want to load those things, and everyone could be stronger. Everyone could be more powerful. And I know that, if you can only deadlift 100 pounds when we meet, and I get you to maybe a 200 or 300 pound deadlift, that you're going to be better at anything you want to do. The ski trip you go on, the next swim event you're going to do, to a degree, like we don't necessarily need you to get to a 400 pound deadlift. Maybe we do, like, maybe Caleb Dressel, the fastest freestyler, one of the fastest freestylers in the world right now, maybe he needs a 400 pound deadlift. But my guy who's going to do his triathlon this weekend, maybe a 200 pound deadlift decreases his incidence of lower back pain, decreases his body fat, gives him confidence. He's doing a triathlon, so there's translation to the bike and the run. And we're just, I don't know, we're checking a lot of boxes with just a good core lift that everyone should be doing from grandmom to an aspiring college athlete.
I mean, I'm the easiest sell on this stuff because I I could regurgitate everything you're saying with such conviction. It's hard to overstate how valuable a basic exercise like that is performed well and proficient and getting better over time, what that can do for everything. And I've heard, so over years of talking to friends or clients that are doing different things in like the swim, bike, run space, one thing, and I respect this because as we get older and life gets more serious, your time availability to, stick around after school and do recess for an extra 2 hours goes away. So there's also this time element where you want to be a better swimmer, a better biker, and a better runner. All those are volume exercises where you have to get reps in. That takes time. Maybe you don't live in an area where you can just walk out the door and go for a bike ride. So you got to throw it on your car and you got to get out there. You got to get to the pool, and that's certain times. So the available time that people then have left over, theoretically, to strength train becomes unfortunately minimal. And I've heard people, I think this is where the argument for like, well, I'm getting the lower body work when I'm running, so let's just do upper body kind of stuff, it really comes through. But it's so valuable to carve out, even if it's a 2-time-a-week frequency where you can really just hammer away those essential movements, how much it can do, not guaranteed, but how much it can do for your longevity. Something you said like back pain. I mean, the transition from swimming to biking and then biking for a while, that's a lot of demand on your body. And if you can do something like take a deadlift from 100 pounds to 160 pounds pain-free, that can have a massive difference in how your body just mechanically exists in the world. But what do you say to that argument, the time exchange? Like, I don't think I have enough time to do that. Or is that, maybe that's something you don't even really deal with because the athletes that you're working with are more specific to these certain distances?
I know that's a very real challenge that I have, and I'm having this conversation constantly. And I just did a little post. Someone asked me if I only had 10 minutes a day to strength train, what would that look like? And I had someone doing I had someone doing a deadlift, vertical push, and a vertical pull. So they were trap bar deadlifting, doing pull-ups, and doing a push press with a barbell. And I'm having this conversation a lot because I work with a lot of triathletes who might be training 20 hours per week, and it's like,
right.
Like I don't even want to train that much. Where would I find 2 more hours to lift?
Totally.
So maybe it is 10 minutes of 5x5 trap bar deadlift. And that's a big example for me is like, if you only came in and did one thing, let's hit your deadlifts this week or for the month. I work with some age group swimmers, some younger swimmers who have an incredible school demand. They're training 12 to 15 hours per week, and they have an interest in adding strength training, which they don't have good resources for with their current programming and their, where the community. So where do we find that time? It's like, let's get 10 minutes of this in. Can you do one thing? Can we take your pull-ups from 8 to 12 this month? Can we take your deadlift from 100 pounds to 200 pounds? You don't have to deadlift that much, actually, if all you cared about was increasing your deadlift, it's not a lot of work.
No.
I think sometimes we over-program, we do too much stuff. And even I know myself, as I turn my strength training session into a cardio, into a workout, because it's checking a lot of boxes for me.
Right.
But if all I really cared about was increasing my deadlift, that's a really easy, short thing to do. You could go in and do probably a bunch of singles or triples and get strong.
Yeah, and that you could go in, and if it's just one exercise, let's say that it was a squat, you're saying all I have time, I don't like to deadlift, and all I have time for is squat. If you take 20 minutes and the first 10 are spent really wisely preparing your body to do that one thing, you're actually going to be better at doing the one thing, and you don't have to do a ton of other work because it involves so many muscle groups. So obviously in a perfect world, you do have some allotted time, but I would agree. I think overtraining is an easy thing to end up doing on accident because people want to feel like they're getting a workout in, but it doesn't have to be that way when you're juggling all these different pieces of performance. But it really does need to exist on some level. I struggle with this all the time for myself. It sounds like you do too, a little bit. I have a high volume of other things outside of the gym at this point that I didn't always have in the past that are big time desires of mine, things I love to do. And they're really applications of all the training in the real world, surfing and jujitsu and all this stuff. I can't do those at the volume I do them and maintain a 4-day-a-week training split like I used to. But I've boiled this down to some very essential things that are important to the activities that I love, but mechanically good just for me in general to maintain health. And it's so crazy how your body adapts when you become specific and like smart about the things you're doing instead of trying to do so many different things at once. Like, you can maintain lower body strength through a squat doing it twice a week if you're smart about the programming. Mm-hmm. And I think when people experience that, it becomes another one of those like important little notches, like showing them the end result of like, hey, you've been doing all this stuff and now you're getting the benefit of it. So you can exist in both of those at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you can't be good at everything. I've seen studies showing something as little as a one repetition max once per week can help you maintain strength for a really long time, or whatever the goal is. If it's a 3 rep max for like your sport, it might be more sport specific, but it's easy to maintain strength. And that's also a big programming focus for me, is helping endurance athletes maintain their gains in season when
right.
the demands of their other training start to become overwhelming and we have to pare back on the strength training a little bit. It's easy to maintain. It's also something that I'm always, I don't know, it's like I'm like an advocate for just maintaining, because when some people just like fall back and they lose all their progress, it's like it's easy to maintain. Let's just hold on to it. Let's bare minimum, the minimum effective dose, while these other demands of your life are getting in the way. And we can't be driving fitness, but we can at least hold on to what we've gained, I guess.
It's kind of interesting thinking now about, I love these conversations because I always end up in the middle of them starting to think about the thing we're talking about. And just kind of talking out loud here, like I'm thinking about buoyancy. And if you just placed a body in water prone and just released it and saw what happened, your joint proficiencies are going to have a big impact in how that body maintains the position, right? Like if you lack cervical flexion or extension, and so you can't get your chin close to your chest and elongate your body through the top of your head, and then dorsiflex your feet and point your heels or vice versa and get your toes pointed, then you're going to shorten the distance between the two lines, and then it's going to begin to fall, right? So something 100%. Like a postural screen, which is a prerequisite for most intelligent training programs, strength training programs, becomes a really instrumental tool for something like swimming that you wouldn't get if you weren't interested in strength training. You might not do that. But if you do that and understand where your deficiencies are, and then you can address those things like hip tightness. If you're always in a anterior pelvic tilt, you're going to have a tough time getting into a quality posture for certain swim strokes, right?
I mean, for all of them, streamline is like the epitome of posture.
For everything.
and narrowing your shape through the water is the number one thing. Like reducing drag is the number one thing you can do to swim faster. I don't care how fit you get, how strong you get. If you have bad streamline, you're creating more drag, and the human body is already really inefficient. We're not fish. We're not boats. So we really need to work on streamlining the position we have, and that comes down to all the postural points that you just mentioned.
So then even like, okay, kettlebell, here's another good example of like a kettlebell snatch is a pretty demanding exercise, right? You need the ability to drive up overhead. You have to have thoracic mobility so that you don't roll forward. And to actually get to the place where you can lock out a snatch it's a tough thing. So if you took someone who, let's say they are doing an overhead squat and you notice thoracic tightness, and then pre-session you can improve the range and then utilize the improvement, and over time get them to a place where even if it's light, let's say it's not even a kettlebell, let's say you're just getting them used to doing the motion with a tennis ball or something, and you can get them to a place where they can do that mechanical advantage from strength training now completely changed their extension in their swim stroke.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, I have a big kettlebell bias, so the snatch to me is like the pinnacle of freestyle or backstroke, and being able to get your arm overhead and get into those positions that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
I just had a client call on Monday with someone who's going to join my swim group, and he goes to a great gym that I actually train at, and this training's really smart, and he was describing all this stuff of how I've had swim coaches in the past who didn't appreciate that my lack of thoracic rotation, he was using these words, was limiting his ability to rotate in the pool. And he's like, and now I'm going to Uptown Movement and they're working on my thoracic rotation and I'm able to rotate better when I swim. And he's like, and he's looking for a coach who's able to connect those dots and help both, and not just say, hey, you need to rotate more when you're in the water. It's like, well, what does that mean? Or like, your thoracic's tight. It's like, well, I don't know what my thoracic is. If you have someone who can help them with both, I don't think we always even need to talk about those things. If someone can just feel it, it's like, hey, get out of the water. Let's do this rotation drill. All right, get back in the water, do your set. And they're like, wow, I feel so much better. Or their time's better, or their stroke count is down. That's how you win them over. And they don't always need to know like the nuts and bolts behind what happened.
Well, I think that's what makes a great coach, right? Is it sounds like you can take your wealth of knowledge and deliver it in the form of a little exercise where someone goes, oh, yeah, I felt that. And then you don't have to make it too complex for them where they're confused. When you mentioned rotation, I've always wondered about this. In a swim stroke, so if I'm thinking about efficiency, and correct me where I'm wrong, per stroke, you want to cover the most distance that you can in the pool or the water, right?
To a degree.
Okay. So we'll circle back to that in a second. If I'm rotating as I'm swimming, then I'm going to create more drag in the water, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want excessive thoracic rotation, but I need the rotation for clearance of my arm repositioning into the next stroke. So how do you manage that combination of necessity for thoracic rotation and mobility without creating an inefficient swim stroke?
You know, swimming's a catch-22 because actually moving your arms and your legs to create propulsion is also creating drag. So hopefully the propulsion outweighs the drag. There's to answer your question, there's an optimal amount of rotation. It's like 20 to 35 degrees rotation side to side. And it depends on the type of swimming you're doing. So the sprinting technique is going to be a different type of rotation than a distance technique. The rotation is going to allow you to cover more distance per stroke with each rotation and cover more ground. And it gives you the shoulder mobility and freedom to get your arm around and come through with that stroke. So it depends on your event and the intensity. But yes, we want to make those connections and help someone open up their thoracic. So like first and foremost, let's like at your thoracic and my thoracic should do the same thing for the most part. We should have a certain amount of range of motion. Let's establish that we both have that. And then, I don't know, we're going to talk about rotation that you need for skiing and talk about the rotation that I need as a 50 sprinter who now does like open water 10Ks. So it's going to be different, but yeah, they both need to rotate. But let's just make sure the slate is clean. Like we have a blank slate. It's like, all right, now we'll teach the body or the brain to rotate as much as it should for the given activity and demand.
It's funny seeing, again, similarities in sport. Like if you take something like a half kneeling chop or a half kneeling lift and you're getting this like hip stabilization, thoracic mobility, that pays off in skiing huge because there's hip flexion and hip extension at the same time. That's like the rolling over of a ski turn. And then if you look to swimming, again, correct me where I'm wrong, but if you want some degree of pelvic stability to allow the rotation to happen without compromising the direction in the water. And so again, an exercise like a half kneeling chop is kind of a foundational, like anti-rotational exercise for anybody. But now it has these two massive payoffs for completely different sports. Like there's all these things that we should really be able to do that increase your proficiency anywhere, maybe with the exception of like super elite, right at the top.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the deadlift, I think there's things that make a good 600-pound deadlifter. There are changes to your body that might not be the most advantageous for having good rotation, for example. I hear Eric Cressy talk about that a lot with baseball players. Like Eric Cressy could deadlift 600 plus pounds. He's an athletic guy. He's strong. A really great baseball coach. He's not having his pitchers deadlift 600 pounds or even think about going in that direction. But they're trap bar deadlifting probably, I don't know, strong guys 400 or 500 pounds, and there's benefits. But there's some stiffness in the gym that helps you be strong that on like the end of the spectrum, like we don't need to take athletes there. So there's something in the middle.
Yeah.
I reference a study a lot. The NSCA did a study on college football players and showed the increase in strength over a 4-year college career, but not an increase in power. And I always talk about the most important attribute for sport is probably power. It's not having a 600-pound deadlift. It's being able to accelerate like 300 pounds of body mass as a football player out of your 3-point stance and being able to like knock someone over or whatever,
Right.
block someone. So being able to translate strength to power is probably most important. So there's ways to think about that athletically when we train people in the gym, and not think of taking them to like, turning everyone into a power lifter actually wouldn't be the best idea probably for athletics.
This is, I mean, admittedly, the mistakes of an early trainer, like you can get carried away with the progress of a client really early on. I think, especially when you're new in this career, because it's exciting. You're sharing this experience with someone, you're watching them before your eyes, and they're experiencing it in real time, that they're becoming strong to a degree that they had never experienced before in their life, didn't know that they were capable of. And it does become easy to hop on that train when, if you could take that same client and build them up to a level of proficiency that's much below where we're saying this example is, and then get them to do that quickly, or to stop that quickly, or to change that direction quickly. And so now you take someone who's, let's say they're 175 pounds, and you've got them very proficiently moving 150 pounds around in different directions. The longevity benefits there are huge. And then just their ability as an individual to take that into any sport. It's hard. I mean, that's even hard for, I have to remind myself this constantly in my training, that like there's the fun stuff and there's the really applicable stuff. And it's important to remember that, so that what you're doing does have purpose where you're going. And it's interesting what you say about the pitchers, because he's still having them deadlift. They all are. Everyone in Cressy's facility, I would imagine almost everyone is performing a deadlift at one point, but the degree to which they're, or the intensity that they're managing at that varies. Because, like you said, a 600-pound deadlift isn't that applicable to a pitcher, but moving a much more submaximal load quickly is. And so you're saying that even in swimming, that's a very important component for, would you say, athletes or enthusiasts of all levels, is developing some sort of power capabilities?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's built on a foundation of strength. The higher you can make your 1RM, the higher your 50% is going to be training for power. But the goal doesn't need to be taking people to like 600-pound deadlifts. Maybe we see that more in like college, in the college weight room, particularly like football players who there's a big emphasis for strength. But the smart ones are probably also doing, like, I don't know, it'd be cooler if the sexy lifts were the clean and the broad jump, the vertical jump, probably are to some degree, instead of like the squat, deadlift, and bench press, which essentially
slow you down.
Yeah, I mean, at the extremes they do, but
yeah.
Increasing average Joe's squat to a certain degree is like, you're going to run faster, you're going to jump off the block further, you're going to have a better flip turn in the swimming world. So
do you speak with your community about nutritional demands for the sport? Is that something that comes into play at all?
More on like the performance side. So performance nutrition, particularly for these events that take 2 hours or more, really anything over an hour, we're fueling. So we're talking more about like intra-race fueling. Going back to like us being able to coach people holistically on a macro level is like, I want to talk nutrition too, just from like a health and wellness standpoint. So I'm still helping people look at their blood work and, make nutritional changes within my scope of practice, or like helping them kind of navigate communication with their doctor. And I have people who still want to get leaner, and even like athletes who are training like an athlete, but they're struggling with like, I don't know, alcohol intake, from a caloric standpoint, not a habit standpoint, or food choices, whatever the case may be. So yeah, we're talking nutrition, across that whole spectrum.
With those longer events, those you said 2 hours and above, what are things that you focus on with people? Because the nutrition becomes more specific at that level because of the physiological demands that are being placed on the body. So what changes at 2 hours that you're not seeing at an hour, let's say?
Well, I would go back and say anything over an hour, we're starting to talk about fueling. So if it's like, if it's a 70-minute triathlon, maybe we're not going to fuel. But if you're doing a 2-hour one or a 2-hour swim, we're going to fuel at the hour mark. So we're talking about what that is, and we're beginning to do it in training. A lot of that activity is going to be fueled by carbohydrates. So we're talking about how carbohydrates help that, but not making it all like glucose goos. There's an important balance of sucrose and glucose. There might be sweating or may not be if it's cold water. So we're talking about hydration and electrolyte intake. We're talking about muscle preservation. So particularly with training, we need to make sure we're also getting protein, at least on the front and the back end of these events. So because, training for more than an hour is catabolic, you're going to be losing muscle mass, which can be challenging for an endurance athlete. So let's make sure we're holding on to muscle by actually just strength training twice per week and eating enough protein on average every day, like a gram per pound of body weight, something like that.
Do you stick to that? Is that a utilized metric, the 1.2 grams per pound? Does that hold in swimming as well? Because I always thought this was kind of like an outdated 1980s bodybuilder, like tnation.com forum that got buried somewhere far away. But is that something that you actually find application for across multiple clients?
I do, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. But I've actually been looking at this a lot. Looking at guys like Lane Norton, Alan Aragon, who are putting out, who are helping digest like the meta-analyses on various nutritional topics. And I want to know what the evidence-based approach is to this, because like endurance world they're not immune to like some of the bro science and the nonsense. In some aspects, it's crazy. Things that they think is right and their approach. So I'm trying to bring like an evidence-based approach with my experience, but I feel like the protein is pretty definitive. The 1 gram per pound of body weight is kind of like the general term to get people within a range. I think it's like 0.8 to 1.2 grams per kilogram, actually, if I'm saying that right. Well, I could get my math wrong, but we could get very specific about it. And a little bit of a side note, but I've been looking at a lot and trained some older clients as well. Like over the age of 60, your protein requirements actually go up. So you need to be eating even more. And there's some really cool evidence there. You're turning over protein and you need to be eating more. And endurance sports are, I always say, an older athlete's sport. So I'm seeing a lot of people in their 60s, late 50s, 60s and beyond wanting to train. It's even more important that they're lifting weights and they're eating enough protein to maintain muscle.
Yeah, I've always read that and in some case regurgitated it. And I've tried to study myself as best I can, just with how my body responds to macronutrient consumption without being insane on the tracking side of it, just for me on like a personal level. But it seems like if you can get the protein consumption without destroying your caloric intake, and you can manage your carbohydrates, it's going to lend itself to strength training no matter what, in terms of your recovery and your abilities in the weight room. And if anything that we've said prior to this moment holds true, then those benefits within the weight room are going to have a payout within the sport. And so from that logic alone, it seems like even for an endurance sport, maintaining that consumption is going to help you in the long run, because you're going to be able to better perform the sport that you're doing. But you're saying also it's the risk of the catabolic effect of this prolonged duration that you're also combating by having that like protein surplus in your body.
Am I arguing that point? Yeah.
Yeah.
Not to the extent that I've been very specific or know like all the latest evidence on how much protein we should be consuming while we do those things, because they're still fat and carbohydrate fueled. I'm a big fan of some of the more whole food type of fueling sources, which often have an element of protein in them. And I've also seen some stuff on proteins, benefits for like digestion and gut health, particularly when someone's taking in a gross amount of glucose. It can sometimes cause like GI issues. So looking at being a little bit more balanced about fueling within the race, but the big thing is developing muscle and preserving muscle like around those times. A lot of competing, you're kind of leaving some of yourself on the table. Like you're kind of putting yourself out there and you're compromising things. It's a stressor, and there's consequences to that stress. And some of it might be muscle mass. It's it's not tremendous. We're not seeing people like waste away, at least not at the extreme versions, but we could probably be a little bit smarter about it. But there probably is some catabolic, your metabolism probably is a little catabolic when you do a 2+ hour event, and you just try to make up for it going into it and afterwards.
Well, I think that's one of the benefits of people working with someone like yourself is they get to have these conversations before their event. Say, hey, this is kind of what we expect will happen. Here's some things to think about, and let the event be that peak moment in their performance, and then they can get back on board. But when you don't have a coach or you don't have someone who's knowledgeable about that kind of stuff, who do you go talk to about it, right? It's so much information to sift through, even for someone who's dedicated like their life to this kind of stuff, to glean the most important pieces of the information to then be able to deliver it to clients, let alone someone who's like already swamped with work, with training, with all this stuff. And then they're trying to like come across research and analyze data to figure that kind of stuff out. So I was wondering why, because I feel like that's such a huge value add to be able to present to your clients the nutritional component, especially with something that's sports specific. Like for me, nutrition has always been for the purpose of athletics. Like I think just from being a young athlete, I always thought about food as fuel for what I was doing. So even though I wasn't at a younger age reading a lot of the material about it, I was always trying to think like, how can I eat the best so that the things that I love to do will be optimized? But that's not the thought process for most people, right? It becomes something that they think about later in life when they find something that they're interested in, like swimming or triathlon training or endurance training. And so it does become this very special moment where nutrition can be thought of and kind of solved by way of something that they love to do instead.
Yeah, not always rewarding themselves with food because they did it, but to your point of like food is fuel for the body, and it's like food is also like part of the health. It's not just like fitness, it's also health and fitness. So hiring a coach, you're privy to the dozens of people that or hundreds of people that they may have worked with over the years, and the experience that they have that you won't have as like a sample size of one working with yourself or the few people that you've interacted with. And also in terms of where you're at with your fitness journey, you might still be very green from a nutritional standpoint, whereas you and I were thinking about these things as like prepubescent teens getting into strength training and thinking of like, oh, if I eat protein shakes, I'm going to grow muscle. It's like, well, yeah, to some extent, but you also need carbohydrates. And I got into it with like a bodybuilding routine and I've learned that was like beneficial and helpful. And I learned like good technique and different things, but I've since transitioned to more of like an athletic type of approach to my training. So everybody's at a different place in their journey. And if you can, hire someone who has the experience that we have, sometimes we can help eliminate some of those mistakes, which I just like to make the point of like the mistakes are really the biggest thing that I'm kind of pointing out of people who they're just not able to just see the big picture and take a step back and eliminate some of these common mistakes that you're going to make. I think a coach is helpful for kind of managing some of those things for you.
If you blast from the past a little bit here and go back to like high school, young Dan, the athlete, what was it that drew you to strength training? Because for me, that was a very specific thing. Like I remember being I always wanted to be in the weight room before I was old enough to. And then when I was psyched. And then as soon as I noticed that like, wow, what I do in here makes me better out there. And so I have all this off season time. If I can just do tons of work in this gym setting and figure this thing out, then it's this massive 6-month leg up that I can get on the competition. So it was like this weird, like I was just drawn to it from such a young age. Obviously, then it became a career as I got older. It was the thing that led me to leave my original job out of college because like I just missed being around athletics, being in this environment. So when you think back to that time, what was your original relationship with fitness, with strength training while you were a young athlete?
I don't know what the original like draw was like exactly, but I was a multi-sport athlete and was probably drawn to the gym as like another sport, so to speak, of learning a different skill. I was physical. I liked being physical, and the gym was like a way to do that. And then I started to see aesthetic results at a time in my life when my body was changing a lot, and there was probably a hook to some degree in that regard. And I played football for a time where there was a big emphasis on strength, and I remember wanting to gain 10 pounds during the summer to put on some weight. Probably just wanting to be like bigger and stronger in general as a young, like maturing man, young adult, whatever.
Child.
Yeah, man child of wanting to put on some muscle and some strength. And so I did that. But then when I got smarter about it, I saw that I was playing my sports better. I was stronger on the football field. I was stronger in the water. And that was always like a big asset for me, is the early adoption that I took on with strength training and nutrition in the high school years that I took through college, that I find even like 20 years later, not everybody is embracing those things as much as they could be.
Yeah.
More so than they were then. And I was embracing it more so than like my dad, who played college athletics. But there's still so much to be gained in that area. We're still seeing sports who are like late comers as it relates to, strength training for athletic development.
Do you think that interest, that kind of an early mindset, however it came about, is something that led you to, despite an already successful career as a trainer, launching this on your business on your own, the entrepreneurial spirit of the different projects you have your hands in, and the roles that you had at Equinox, to still even take on open water swimming as an adult? Like, that's a lot of stuff on your plate. Why do that?
Like for myself or for my coaching?
Yeah. No, for you personally.
I was a little burnt out with swimming after like 8 years of super intensive swimming, high school through college, and more so in a varied way, playing a bunch of different sports. But I just needed a break and actually loved strength training. I was like, wow, like I don't need to train 20 hours per week anymore. I can train 5 or 6 hours per week. I'm going to hang out in the gym all the time and do like HIIT cardio, because it was like all the fat burning rage.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be lean and jacked and, fit and not have to train as much. And also just like enjoy some things about my life that I wasn't able to, being so dedicated to training 20 hours per week. And really embrace strength training, personal training, that whole world, kettlebell training, Olympic lifting, animal flow, yoga, like all the different modalities, learning all of it. And then kind of learning like what you like, what you're good at. And you have a little bit of like a full circle moment, because now as I'm aging, I really appreciate swimming and how it makes my body feel, and how it's a holistic piece of like my lifting and my swimming. Yeah. I've dabbled in triathlon. I've run a marathon. I still know that I don't want to train 20 hours per week, but I know that I can perform at a pretty high level in like amateur open water races as a former collegiate sprinter who lifts and is smart about training, nutrition, and recovery, and only trains, I don't know, maybe 6 to 10 hours a week at the peak of like a 10K program, but for the most part, training like 5 or 6 hours per week and just feeling lean and strong and aerobically fit, and having a bunch of other stuff like a family and a career and, other hobbies that may not be as health and fitness oriented.
It's hard to, I was actually talking to my dad about this the other day, but it's hard to like box up the feeling of capability to, if I was, you're in New York, right?
Yep.
If I was like, hey, Dan, I'm in New York, there's this amazing hike or like this, this crazy road ride in Hudson River, let's go do it. That ability to say yes, sure, yeah, when should I be there? That's such a cool byproduct of living a life where you're pursuing your health and your wellness, is that you like, regardless of your age, and part of it too is that within this career you're surrounded by anomalies at the end of the age spectrums. So you'll meet 55-year-olds that are performing like 30-year-olds. You'll meet people in their 60s that are dedicating themselves to swimming. You'll meet people in their 70s that are strength training. So you're always being reminded of these people that are the exception to the rule. At the same time that you're finding a way to put in effort to live this more holistic lifestyle of capability. And I just wish I could deliver that feeling to everyone, that they could understand like what being on the other. So once you get over the hump of like taking on something new and navigating the days that you don't want to be in and you don't want to put in the work, or it's hard to show up, you got other stuff going on, but to get on the other side of it and to have that feeling of capability is so cool. And it's awesome to see businesses like yours grow, because it's connecting with people. They have a pre-existing hobby. they introduce something like strength training for the first time under the guidance of a coach who really knows what he's talking about, and now their life's changed. Like that's one of the reasons that I do love the fitness industry, is that it has such a power to do that for people.
Also, it's a lifestyle for us and for them, and we're like a conduit for that, for other people to realize it. And you really summed up like my whole coaching philosophy is I think fitness is being able to meet various demands on a moment's notice with no preparation. So
Yes.
like you said, I want to go on the hike. I want to be able to join a friend for a 5K run. I'm not always like marathon volume ready, but I think you should be able to run a mile at a certain pace or vigor. You should be able to, swimming is a little bit less approachable for everyone, but I'd like to think everyone can swim and should be able to, like, let's make that accessible. I was just thinking about it yesterday. I've been invited to do like Spartan races on a whim, like 16-mile beast events. And it's like,
Yep.
maybe with a 6-week build up, it's like, yeah, I'll do that. I got to build up to 16 miles and be able to do this. I want to be able to do all of those things, play with my 6-year-old, and just have the fitness to be able to participate in those things and not have physical limitations for things that are reasonable. And then other things you train for, it feels like an accomplishment because you did work hard for it and got out of your comfort zone and did something a little scary.
What is it like to have a 6-year-old that you can fully meet at energy level and capability?
I don't know. I probably take it for granted to some extent that I'm not aware of those limitations that maybe other dads have. But he and I are super physical, and some of his friends and like parents might recognize the fact that he's able to run faster or scoot harder because like we're out,
Right.
ripping it up in the city. And I want to push those boundaries and do all those things because I was doing that as a kid, and I want to be able to maintain those things and not feel like I'm physically limited. I think some people even struggle to like get down on the ground and like play with their kids at various points, or their grandkids. So we're helping people do those things, and you and I are trying to maintain those things. I'm 40 now, so I'm aware of that aging process, and I want to hold on to it. And I still feel like I'm going to hit some fitness and athletic peaks that I haven't hit yet.
Wait, what? You're 40?
Yep.
Wow. I had no idea that you're 40. But that is like, that's insane to me. That's what fitness and wellness does. Is it maintains your youth. Like straight up on a cellular level, it's doing that, and on a physical level, it's doing that. That's insane. So you had your son when you were 34.
Yep.
It's funny. I remember specifically when I was a kid. My dad had built houses since he was like 17, and he was just like a physical person when I was younger. He ran some Ironmans, and he was just a competitive guy. And we'd always kind of like, I'd go have a ski event and he'd snowboard to the event, or like he'd walk up the hill from the base all the way to the event and watch and then go down with me. And I just remember sometimes my friends' dads, I never saw them do anything. Like great people, wonderful people, welcomed me into their home. I had great friends growing up, but I would never see their parents do anything other than they'd be present at, family dinners, stuff like that, or maybe they had a job, but like the physicality of seeing them do physical stuff, it wasn't there. I just didn't see it. And now that I'm getting to that age where people are starting to have kids, and I have friends that have children, you start to see how valuable it is to be able to, even something like you said, to get down to the floor. Like that sounds hilarious, but it's not, because that's a tall task for some people to play with their children. Like, I mean, this is about swimming and coaching and everything, but the real life representation of all this stuff is no better expressed than in a parent being able to physically be present and play with their child. Like, I don't know. I think that's like the biggest takeaway of all this stuff.
Or, in our world, it's going on a 20-mile training run for your marathon and being able to come home and like play with your kids or take care of like your household duties and not be like a total wreck.
Yeah.
Because you just did something that's like way out of your age. I don't know what society or like your friend group thinks is appropriate for your age category.
It was funny. My dad, he's now doing, have you heard of DECA? Fit. Have you
I
heard
have
of
not.
those events? So DECA is a Spartan. It's under the Spartan umbrella, but this is actually really cool. You should check this out. So they do 3 events. One's called a strong, a mile, and a fit, and they're all 10 exercise, basically circuit events where you either do the 10 exercises by themselves, or you do them with a 500-meter run, or you do them with a total of mile run by the end of it. I might be getting the distances wrong, but it's basically like something that someone who's new to fitness can put on their docket as like something that they want to do that doesn't require you to be proficient in like all the Olympic lifts and kipping pull-ups and crazy stuff like that, but also not the endurance demands of like a triathlon. So it kind of falls in the middle of functional fitness meets different body weight movements and accessory movements. And we were just joking about, he goes in to train, he's 57, and he goes in to train for these events, and it's like him with a bunch of 25 or 30-year-olds and the occasional other guy that's like, a tip of the hat because they recognize each other's like being there. But yeah, it is interesting as you get older that something like that, like going and doing your training efforts could completely wipe you out for the rest of the day, next couple of days. But we so sidebarred here to a more esoteric conversation about parenthood and longevity. But yeah, it's been really cool talking to you, Dan. I like I said, always love these conversations because it selfishly makes me think differently about other sports that exist out there and ways to coach and train. We'll 100% include in the show notes all the links to Dan's website, his social channels, so that you can connect with him and reach out if you have any interest in bettering your swim abilities or any kind of training abilities. He's a phenomenal coach. So thank you for taking the time to do this, Dan.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks, Abe. Great conversation. It's just cool to talk shop with someone similar minded and, connect the dots between different activities but a lot the same.
Yeah, absolutely. We will do this again in the future. So